Before diving into this incredible story, consider subscribing to the channel and hitting the bell. Every story here has something to say, and you won't want to miss a single one. New York was shining brightly that evening. On the illuminated streets, luxury cars lined up outside one of Manhattan's most prestigious hotels, where a charity gala organized by the country's wealthiest people had just concluded. The guests, dressed in tuxedos and sparkling gowns, left in their limousines, exchanging polite smiles and promises of business. In the midst of this excitement, one man stood out with his presence and aura: Richard Coleman, a billionaire renowned for his colossal investments and political influence. His graying hair, piercing gaze, and confident gait inspired both respect and fear. The newspapers described him as a business genius, but also as a cold, calculating man, impervious to anything that didn't have a market value. As he descended the steps of the hotel, flanked by his bodyguards, his gaze suddenly fell on a scene off to one side, near a lamppost. There, a woman in worn clothes, she was holding a little boy of barely 7 years old. The mother tried to smile at him despite his tired face, but the boy's features revealed hunger and weariness. Richard, who was about to get into his car, then heard the child's voice, clear and fragile. "Mom. I'm still hungry." These words, simple and innocent, resonated in the silence of his heart. For a split second, the billionaire froze. His memories, carefully buried for years, suddenly resurfaced. What he would do next would surprise not only the woman and her son, but everyone who crossed their path. Richard Coleman stopped at the curb, one hand resting on his car door. His bodyguards exchanged a surprised look. Normally, nothing would distract their boss from his minute-by-minute schedule. But tonight, something had disrupted his rhythm. The businessmen watched the woman and child. She tried to keep her head high, but her slumped shoulders betrayed exhaustion. She gently stroked the little boy's hair, trying to appease his hunger with words rather than a meal. Richard approached slowly, his footsteps echoing on the pavement. The suspicious mother sat up suddenly, hugging her son. I'm sorry, sir. We're just passing through," she said in a trembling voice, already believing he was going to chase them away. But to everyone's surprise, Richard calmly replied, "You don't need to apologize." He leaned slightly towards the child, who stared at him with round eyes, hesitating between fear and curiosity. "What's your name, kid?" Richard asked. The boy squeezed his mother's hand before whispering, "Daniel." A heavy silence fell, interrupted only by the sound of traffic. Richard took a deep breath, then, unexpectedly, he said, "Come with me. I'll invite you to dinner." The mother's eyes widened, thinking it was a bad joke. The bodyguards, however, remained frozen, unable to comprehend what was happening. Because never, in his entire public life, had Richard Coleman made such a gesture. And yet, tonight, everything began to change. Elena, Daniel's mother, hesitated for a long time. Her gaze shifted from her son to the billionaire, then to the two bodyguards, who seemed just as puzzled as she was. No one really understood why a man like Richard Coleman, accustomed to star-studded dinners and multi-million-dollar contracts, would suddenly take an interest in a tired stranger and her child. You want to have dinner with us?" she asked, her voice cracking with disbelief. Richard didn't answer right away. He simply slipped his hands into the pockets of his cashmere coat and said calmly, "No, I want you to come and have dinner with me." "It's not the same thing." Daniel looked up at his mother shyly. His stomach rumbled loud enough for Richard to hear. The billionaire gave a small smile. "Come on, it's just a meal. Nothing more." Before Elena could find an excuse to refuse, he opened the back door of his limousine himself and nodded. Passers-by, intrigued by the scene, had stopped, whispering among themselves. Seeing the coldest businessman in New York invite a poor woman and her son into his car was almost a miracle. The drive was silent, punctuated only by the purr of the engine. Elena held her son close, still wary, while Daniel gazed with fascination at the luxurious interior of the vehicle, the leather seats, the integrated screens, the soft light bathing the cabin. A few minutes later, the limousine pulled up in front of a renowned Manhattan restaurant. The waiters, upon seeing Richard Coleman, rushed to the entrance to greet him. But their smiles froze when they noticed his guests. Elena felt everyone's eyes on her and her son as they walked through the restaurant doors. She wanted to step back, ashamed, but Richard's firm hand on her shoulder gently pushed her forward. "Tonight, you are my guests," he declared in a voice that brooked no argument. The murmur in the room rose a notch. The elegant and arrogant customers were already whispering, unable to comprehend what a billionaire was doing with a penniless woman and a starving child. What they didn't know yet was that this dinner would change the destiny of 3 lives. The restaurant was steeped in a heavy atmosphere. Cutlery clinked, whispers persisted, but at the back table, an eerie silence reigned. Richard Coleman, his gaze fixed on Elena and her son, said nothing. He simply observed them. The waiter, feeling uneasy, placed a plate of pasta and vegetables in front of Daniel. The boy, initially intimidated, began to eat with desperate haste. Elena, her eyes brimming, placed her hand on her son's to slow him down. "Easy, Daniel, you're going to hurt yourself," she whispered. Richard, seeing this scene, felt a dull ache rise in his chest. It reminded him of memories he had sworn to bury forever. He leaned slightly towards Elena. "Tell me. How did you get here?" Elena lowered her eyes, hesitant. She had never liked to expose her misery, especially to those who, like this man, seemed to live in another world. But Richard's insistent gaze, more human than cold at that moment, prompted her to speak. "I had a normal life," she began in a trembling voice. "My husband worked in construction. He was courageous and hardworking. But one day, on a construction site, there was an accident. A poorly secured beam." Her voice broke, and she squeezed Daniel's hand tighter. "They told me he hadn't suffered. But his death destroyed everything we had. With one salary, I could barely pay the rent. I lost the apartment, then the job, and, since then, we've been living between shelters and the streets." A heavy silence followed her words. Richard stared at her unblinkingly, but his fingers tightened around his wine glass. Each of Elena's words resonated within him like a bitter echo of his own loss. Daniel, who had finished his plate, looked up at Richard and said with the innocence of childhood, "Mom always says we have to keep hope, but sometimes I'm afraid she'll cry when I'm sleeping." The room suddenly seemed to disappear around Richard. This boy, with his disarming sincerity, had just opened a breach in the wall the billionaire had built around his heart for years. He then understood that he was not just witnessing a passing distress. He had just encountered a story that would turn his own life upside down. Richard remained silent for a long time after Elena's story. His eyes seemed lost in space, fixed on some invisible point behind her. His bodyguards, stationed near the entrance, exchanged worried glances. They had never seen their boss in such a state of uncertainty. Elena, embarrassed, thought she had spoken too much. "Excuse me. I shouldn't have," she began, lowering her head. But Richard interrupted him, in a low, grave voice. "No. You did the right thing." He put down his glass, took a deep breath, then blurted out words he hadn't confided to anyone in years. "I had a son." Elena looked up in surprise. Daniel, intrigued, stopped playing with his fork. Richard continued, his gaze hardening under the weight of memories. "His name was William. He was about your age, Daniel," he said, looking at the child with tenderness, "but he left, too soon. A rare disease. No doctor, no hospital, no amount of money could save him." His voice cracked slightly, but he continued, determined to see it through to the end. "Since that day, I closed all doors. I believed that money could help me forget, so I dove into my businesses, my investments, my companies. I built towers, bought companies, but at the end of the day, I always came home to an empty house." A heavy silence enveloped the table. Elena felt her eyes moisten, not with pity, but with understanding. She knew what it meant to lose a part of yourself. Daniel, for his part, timidly placed his little hand on Richard's. "I'm sorry, sir," he he said simply. Richard looked down at this childish gesture, and something inside him cracked. For years, he hadn't let anyone touch his heart. But tonight, facing this boy and his mother, the wall he had built was slowly crumbling. For the first time in a long time, Richard Coleman felt the weight of his millions evaporate, replaced by an emotion he thought lost: humanity. Dinner was drawing to a close. Elena, still shaken by having shared her story, shyly thanked Richard for the meal. She was already preparing to leave, convinced that this evening was only a fleeting interlude in her harsh reality. "Thank you, Mr. Coleman, you have already done more than I could have imagined." "I don't want to take advantage of your kindness," she said, standing up slowly, holding Daniel by the hand. But Richard didn't move. His dark eyes stared at her intently, as if he'd just made a decision that admitted no reversal. "Sit down, Elena," he said in a firm but calm voice. The young woman, troubled, obeyed. Daniel looked at her questioningly. Richard then took a small black leather notebook from the inside pocket of his jacket. His bodyguards exchanged a stunned look. They knew what this notebook contained. It was the one where the billionaire recorded his most important commitments, the decisions that changed lives, businesses, sometimes even cities. Richard picked up his pen and said in a tone that left no room for hesitation. "Tomorrow morning, you'll start working for one of my companies. Not as an office cleaner, no. I need an assistant for a humanitarian project I've neglected for too long." Elena's eyes widened. "But I don't have any experience. I don't understand why me." Richard gently cut him off. "Because I don't just want to give you money, Elena. I want to give you back your dignity. You have strength, I see it. And Daniel deserves to see his mother standing, not crushed by the weight of life." Elena felt her throat tighten. The tears she had been holding back fell despite herself. Daniel, his eyes shining, whispered, "Mom, are we going to have a house?" Richard gave a small smile. "Yes, Daniel. You'll be allocated a place to live tomorrow. You'll never have to sleep on the streets again." At these words, a silence fell over the restaurant. Those who had been watching the scene from the beginning couldn't believe their ears. The cold billionaire, known for his insensitive nature, had just shattered his own image before their eyes. And for Elena and Daniel, that night marked the end of a life of suffering, and the beginning of an unexpected future. The news didn't take long to spread. Every customer in the restaurant had witnessed the scene. Some had discreetly filmed it with their phones, others were already secretly taking photos. In a world where everything is shared in an instant, the story of Richard Coleman and the homeless woman and her son would soon spread beyond the restaurant walls and reach the entire city. Around them, the whispers grew louder. "It's incredible, he offered a job to a stranger. Perhaps it's a setup to improve his image." "No, did you see his eyes? That man was sincere." Elena felt uncomfortable, feeling all these eyes on her. She wanted to disappear, to become invisible again, as she had always been in this immense city. But Daniel's reassuring hand in hers calmed her a little. Richard, however, remained impassive, as if indifferent to the whispers. Yet, behind his usual cold mask, he felt a strange mixture of appeasement and vulnerability. He knew he had just crossed a line he had forbidden himself since his son's death, that of letting someone into his world. As we left the restaurant, a small crowd had already formed. Local journalists, alerted by messages on social media, were waiting outside. Camera flashes popped as they spotted Richard accompanied by Elena and Daniel. "Mr. Coleman, who is this woman? Is it true that you offered him a job and a place to live? Why this sudden act of generosity?" Richard paused for a moment, gently squeezing Daniel's shoulder as he hid behind him. Then he said, in a clear, confident voice, "Because this isn't an act of generosity. It's about justice. No one should have to choose between feeding their child and sleeping on the streets." A respectful silence followed his words. Even the most skeptical, accustomed to seeing him as a man of stone, sensed that there was a profound truth in what he had just said. This statement, captured on camera, would soon inflame social media and the national media. Within hours, Richard Coleman, the billionaire known for his coldness and insensitivity, would become the man whose gesture had surprised and shocked everyone. But for Elena and Daniel, it was just the beginning of a new life. The next morning, Elena and Daniel were driven by a private driver to their new home. Daniel, his eyes wide, couldn't believe his senses. The streets of New York City flashed by, but this time, he no longer saw the cold, intimidating buildings of the city. He saw an opportunity, a promise. The apartment Richard had provided was located in a quiet, secure neighborhood. The immaculate walls, large windows letting in the morning light, and carefully chosen furniture radiated an unexpected warmth for Elena, who was used to cramped and dark rooms. Is this for us?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Yes, Elena. It's for you and Daniel. Take it as the first step towards a new life," replied Richard. Daniel ran through the living room, touching the plush sofas, opening drawers to check they were filled with clothes and school supplies. Every detail seemed to have been designed to provide them with comfort and security. Elena sat on the couch, breathing deeply. For the first time in months, she felt a real sense of security and relief. She no longer had to worry about where her son would sleep tonight or what he would eat tomorrow. "Mom, look!" Daniel shouted, pointing to a small desk for him. "I can finally have my books and drawings here." Elena smiled, feeling tears welling up. She placed her hand on her son's. "Yes, my dear. This is our home now." Richard, watching them from the doorway, felt his heart warm. Seeing Daniel smile, hearing his laughter echoing in that space, awakened in him a feeling he hadn't felt since William's death, hope and the simple joy of life. "I'll come back tonight to see how you're settling in," announced Richard, before slipping away discreetly. Elena looked out the window after he left. The summer sun bathed the city in a golden light. For the first time, she understood that life could offer unexpected surprises. And for Daniel, this new home wasn't just a roof, it was the symbol of a new beginning, filled with promise and security. In the days that followed, Richard Coleman continued to involve himself in Elena and Daniel's lives. What had begun as a simple gesture of generosity gradually transformed into something more profound. Every morning, before diving into his meetings and business, Richard took the time to spend a few minutes with Daniel. He helped him prepare his breakfast, choose his clothes, and sometimes even revise his lessons. Daniel, initially shy, gradually opened up to this new presence in his life. "Mr. Coleman," says Daniel one morning as he mashed his bowl of cereal, "you're kind of like a dad to me, aren't you?" Richard smiled, a genuine emotion crossing his eyes. "Maybe. Or maybe just someone who wants to see his smile every day," he answered softly. Elena, too, began to notice changes in Richard. The once distant businessman seemed to soften. He asked her questions about her well-being, her plans and dreams for the future. Gradually, Elena felt she could lean on him without fear of judgment or reproach. In the evenings, Richard would sometimes share dinner with them, chatting about everything and nothing, telling anecdotes from his past, and, above all, listening attentively. Daniel would laugh out loud at some of the stories, and Elena saw in these moments an unexpected bond grow between them. One afternoon, while the three of them were walking in the park near their apartment, Richard stopped to watch Daniel playing ball with some other children. He noticed the confidence and joy emanating from him. "You know, Elena," he began, his tone serious but gentle, "there are things money can't buy. Family, love, trust. This boy teaches me more about life than all my businesses combined." Elena smiled, touched by this sincerity. She understood that Richard wasn't just helping them financially, he was opening up to them, offering them a part of his heart that he had long kept closed. For the first time in a long time, Richard Coleman felt his life had real meaning outside of business. And for Daniel and Elena, this unexpected connection became a pillar upon which they could finally rebuild their lives. A few weeks later, Richard Coleman attended a different charity gala, this time for the city's underprivileged children. But unlike his usual appearances, this time he wasn't alone. At his side were Elena and Daniel, dressed simply but elegantly, representing what the billionaire had wanted to show, a living example of generosity and renewal. When the photographers and reporters spotted them, a murmur ran through the room. Flashes popped as they made their way to the stage. Richard, usually stoic, took the microphone with a calm but emotional composure. "Tonight, I'm not just here to talk about money or donations," he began. The room fell silent, hanging on his words. "I want to share a story, that of Elena and her son Daniel, who reminded me what is truly important in life." Elena felt her hand tremble slightly in Daniel's. The boy, curious and proud, gently squeezed her hand. "A few weeks ago, I met this courageous mother and her son. They were living on the streets, enduring hardships we can't even imagine. And I realized that money, even if it's huge, is worthless if we don't use it to help those who really need it." Applause erupted in the room. Some guests, initially skeptical, were moved by Richard's sincerity and transparency. Photographers captured the moment. Elena and Daniel smiled shyly but deeply gratefully. "This gesture," continues Richard, "this is not an isolated action. It is a reminder to all of us, everyone can make a difference, regardless of their position or status." Journalists immediately published Richard's images and words. Social media went wild. The story of the billionaire reaching out to a destitute mother and son quickly went viral. Articles, television shows, and blogs praised his initiative, but more importantly, they highlighted the human change he had wrought. For Elena and Daniel, this public recognition wasn't just a source of pride, it was validation of their regained dignity. And for Richard, it was a revelation: helping others, creating a sincere connection, could transform one's own life far more than any contract or acquisition. That night, as they walked home together, Elena whispered to Richard, "You gave us more than a roof over our heads, you gave us a life." Richard smiled, finally feeling that his long-closed heart had found a home in this unexpected new family. As the months passed, Elena and Daniel's lives changed completely. The small apartment they had been given became a true home, filled with laughter, light, and warmth. Daniel, who had once been fearful and silent, ran through the halls, played in the park, and did enthusiastically at school. Elena, for her part, regained her self-confidence. She had found a stable job, supported by Richard, but above all, she had regained her dignity and pride. Richard, meanwhile, was no longer the cold, solitary man the media had portrayed him as for years. He spent more and more time with them, becoming a father figure to Daniel and a trusted friend to Elena. The moments they shared went far beyond money or material goods. They were moments of pure humanity, filled with laughter, conversation, and complicity. One evening, while the three of them were having dinner in their apartment, Daniel looked up at Richard. "You know, Mr. Coleman, I never had a dad before. But you're like mine now." Richard felt a lump form in his throat. He placed his hand on the boy's. "And you, Daniel, you reminded me what it truly means to love." Elena smiled, her eyes shining. She knew none of this would have been possible without this man who had dared to reach out without expecting anything in return. Over time, their bond grew stronger. Richard, Elena, and Daniel formed a family, chosen and sincere, born from an unexpected gesture and an encounter that had changed the course of their lives. The newspapers continued to talk about the story, but for them, the important thing was elsewhere. They had found what many search for their entire lives but never find: true love, trust, and hope. And in everyone's heart, one certainty remained: sometimes, all it takes is a gesture, an outstretched hand, to change the destiny of several lives at once.